Barren Texas Plains. Susanna Monroe had worked her land alone for years, needing no man's help. But when Garrett Hollis rode onto her ranch, all quiet strength and a dangerous past, she realized some battles couldn't be fought alone. He ran a slow hand over his horse's reins, his voice deep. "You got trouble comin', Susanna," he murmured. "And I don't intend to let it find you alone." Chapter 1. A solitary sunrise over whispering pines. The dawn broke, painting the sky in hues of rose and gold, a breathtaking spectacle that Susanna Monroe greeted with the same weary resignation she felt for most things these days. 58 years she'd lived, and the last 10 had been a solitary battle against the relentless sun, the stubborn earth, and the gnawing loneliness that settled in her bones like the winter chill. Whispering Pines Ranch, her legacy, her burden, stretched out before her, a vast expanse of rolling hills and whispering pines that had once echoed with laughter and the thrum of life. Now, only the wind sang through the trees, a mournful ballad of what had been. She stood on the weathered porch of the ranch house, the wood rough beneath her calloused hands, a mug of strong, black coffee warming her fingers. Her hair, once the color of ripe wheat, was now streaked with silver, pulled back severely from a face etched with the hardships of a life lived under the unforgiving western sky. Her eyes, though, still held a spark of the fierce independence that had defined her, a glint of blue steel that could cut through a man's bravado like a hot knife through butter. She'd buried her husband, Thomas, a decade ago, a good man felled by a bad fever that swept through the territory like a wildfire. Their son, Caleb, had followed him to the grave just 2 years later, a victim of a senseless feud over a waterhole, a tragedy that had carved a hollow in Susanna's heart that no amount of time seemed able to heal. She'd learned to live with the ache, to bury it beneath the endless chores and the bone-deep exhaustion that came with running a ranch single-handedly. The ranch hands had drifted away, one by one, lured by the promise of easier work or bigger paydays in the booming towns to the west. Susanna hadn't blamed them. She couldn't offer much, not anymore. Just the same stubborn pride that kept her rooted to this land, this life, even when it felt like it was slowly sucking the marrow from her bones. She sipped her coffee, the bitter taste of familiar comfort. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the dusty yard. She watched a hawk circle lazily overhead, a solitary hunter against the vast canvas of the sky. A pang of something akin to envy shot through her. Freedom. That's what the hawk had. The freedom to soar, to escape, to leave the weight of the world behind. But Susanna was tethered. To the land, to the memory of her husband and son, to the unspoken promise she'd made to them both to hold on, to keep Whispering Pines alive. It was a promise that felt increasingly impossible to keep. The bank was threatening foreclosure, the cattle were dwindling, and the neighboring rancher, a greedy, beady-eyed man named Bartlett, was circling like a vulture, waiting for her to stumble, to fall, so he could swoop in and claim her land for a pittance. She finished her coffee, the empty mug a cold weight in her hand. The day stretched before her, a daunting list of tasks that seemed to grow longer with each passing sunrise. Mending fences, checking the dwindling water supply, trying to coax a few more pounds of flesh onto the scrawny cattle. It was a losing battle, she knew, but she would fight it nonetheless. She was Susanna Monroe, and she didn't know how to quit. As she turned to go inside, a movement at the edge of the property caught her eye. A rider, silhouetted against the rising sun, approaching slowly, steadily. Her heart gave a little skip, a flicker of apprehension that she quickly squashed. Probably just another drifter, looking for work or a handout. She'd turn him away, as she had all the others. She couldn't afford to take on another mouth to feed, not even for a day. But as the rider drew closer, something about him made her pause. He sat tall in the saddle, his posture suggesting a quiet confidence, a strength that went beyond mere physical presence. He wore a worn leather duster, a wide-brimmed hat shading his face, and a gun belt slung low on his hips. Not a drifter, then. Not exactly. He reined in his horse, a magnificent chestnut mare with a coat the color of burnished copper, a few yards from the porch. He didn't dismount, didn't speak. He just sat there, watching her, his eyes hidden beneath the shadow of his hat. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the whisper of the wind and the distant cry of a hawk. Susanna felt a prickle of unease, a sense of something unknown, something dangerous, approaching her life like a slow-moving storm. She straightened her shoulders, met his unseen gaze with her own unwavering stare. She wouldn't be intimidated. Not by any man. Not on her own land. Finally, he spoke, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the still morning air. "Mrs. Monroe?" It wasn't a question, but a statement, a confirmation of something he already knew. Her name, spoken with a familiarity that sent a shiver down her spine. "Who's asking?" she replied, her voice surprisingly steady, betraying none of the turmoil brewing inside her. He tipped his head slightly, a gesture that was both respectful and subtly challenging. "Name's Garrett Hollis." The name meant nothing to her. And yet, it felt heavy, laden with unspoken implications. She waited, her hand instinctively moving to rest on the worn handle of the old shotgun she kept leaning against the porch railing, a constant companion in these lonely years. He finally dismounted, moving with a fluid grace that belied the ruggedness of his appearance. He approached the porch, his steps slow and deliberate, his eyes, now visible beneath the brim of his hat, fixed on hers. They were the color of the desert sky after a storm, a deep, unsettling gray that seemed to hold both a weariness and a glint of something harder, something that sent another shiver of apprehension through her. He stopped at the foot of the steps, looking up at her, a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips. "I heard you might be needing some help, Mrs. Monroe." His words were soft, but they carried a weight that belied their gentle tone. A weight that hinted at a past he didn't speak of, a past that was as vast and unforgiving as the land that stretched out behind him. The air seemed to hold the unspoken words she wouldn't voice. The vulnerability, the silent plea she would do it alone, and was running out of time. Chapter 2. The shadow of a stranger approaches. Susanna studied him, her gaze taking in every detail. He wasn't a young man, not anymore. Lines of hardship were etched around his eyes and mouth, a testament to a life lived on the edge, a life that had seen its share of sun and sorrow. His jaw was firm, shadowed by a day or two of stubble, and his hands, she noticed, were calloused and strong, the hands of a man who knew how to work, how to fight. He wore his clothes with the ease of someone accustomed to long days in the saddle, the leather duster worn soft and supple, the gun belt riding low and easy on his hips. There was a stillness about him, a quiet intensity that both intrigued and unnerved her. "I don't recall asking for any," she said, her voice tight, her hand still resting on the shotgun. It was a lie, of course. She was drowning, desperately needing a lifeline, but pride, that stubborn, unyielding pride, kept her from admitting it, even to herself. Garrett Hollis didn't seem surprised by her response. He simply nodded, his gray eyes holding hers with a gaze that was both understanding and strangely unsettling. "Word travels fast in these parts, Mrs. Monroe, especially when it concerns a woman alone, trying to hold onto a ranch the size of this one." His words were a subtle challenge, a recognition of her predicament that she couldn't deny. She bristled at the implication, at the hint of pity she thought she detected in his voice. "I've managed just fine on my own for years." "Have you?" he asked, his voice soft, but the question hung in the air like the scent of impending rain. He gestured with a nod of his head towards the vast expanse of the ranch. "It's a lot of land for one person to handle, especially with Bartlett sniffing around like a hungry wolf." The mention of Bartlett's name sent a jolt of anger through her. "Bartlett is nothing to me," she said, her voice sharper now, the steel in her eyes hardening. "And I'll thank you to keep his name out of your mouth." Garrett raised a hand, a gesture of appeasement. "No disrespect intended, Mrs. Monroe. But I know Bartlett, and I know his kind. He's not a man to be trifled with." He wants this land, and he'll do whatever it takes to get it. He won't get it, Susanna said, her voice firm, but a tremor of doubt ran through her. She knew Bartlett's reputation. He was ruthless, greedy, and he had the law in his pocket. The sheriff a corrupt, spineless man who did Bartlett's bidding for a share of the spoils. Garrett studied her for a long moment, his eyes searching hers, as if trying to gauge the depth of her resolve, the truth behind her defiant words. Maybe not, he said finally, but he'll try, and he won't play fair. He paused, letting his words sink in. Then he continued, his voice softer now, almost a whisper. I've seen what happens when good people are pushed too far, when they're left to fight alone against impossible odds. There was a sadness in his voice, a hint of something dark and painful in his past. Susanna felt a flicker of something other than suspicion, a flicker of empathy, perhaps, for this stranger who seemed to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. What's your interest in this, Mr. Hollis? She asked, her voice losing some of its edge. Why come here, offering help to a woman you don't even know? He met her gaze directly, his gray eyes unwavering.
Let's just say I owe a debt, he said.
A debt I intend to repay. The words were cryptic, mysterious, but they resonated with something deep within her. She sensed a story there, a story he wasn't ready to tell, a story that was intertwined with his reasons for being here, on her doorstep, offering his help. She hesitated, torn between her ingrained distrust of strangers and the desperate need for help that she could no longer deny. The ranch was slipping through her fingers, the bank was closing in, and Bartlett was waiting, watching, like a hawk circling its prey. She was alone, facing a battle she couldn't win. I don't need charity, she said, the words sounding hollow even to her own ears.
Garrett shook his head.
This isn't charity, Mrs. Monroe. This is
a proposition.
A partnership, if you will. I'll work for you, help you get this ranch back on its feet. In return, I ask for nothing but a place to stay, food to eat, and a chance to maybe find a little peace. His words, his offer, were unexpected, tempting. She searched his face, looking for any sign of deception, any hint of an ulterior motive. But she found only a weariness, a quiet strength, and a sincerity that surprised her. She looked out at her ranch, at the land she loved, the land she was losing. She thought of Thomas, of Caleb, of the promise she'd made to them. She thought of the long, lonely years, the endless struggle, the growing despair. And then, she looked back at Garrett Hollis, at the stranger who had ridden out of the sunrise, offering her a lifeline, a chance, however slim, to save everything she held dear. What kind of work are you used to, Mr. Hollis? She asked, her voice still cautious, but the wall she'd built around herself was beginning to crumble, brick by brick. A small crack appeared in her wall, a crack that she wasn't sure she could, or would ever want to, repair. It gave way for a question, hanging heavy in the morning air. Chapter 3. Scars of the Past, Echoes of the Present. Garrett held her gaze, the faint smile that had touched his lips earlier now gone, replaced by a seriousness that seemed to settle deep within his gray eyes. All kinds, Mrs. Monroe, he replied, his voice low and steady. I've worked cattle, broken horses, mended fences. And I've done things I'm not proud of. The last part of his statement hung in the air, a confession, a warning, a glimpse into the shadowed past he carried with him. Susanna felt a prickle of apprehension, but also a strange sense of understanding. She, too, carried regrets, burdens of choices made, of paths not taken. What kind of things? She asked, the question a challenge, a test. She needed to know, needed to understand the kind of man she was considering letting into her life, onto her land. He didn't flinch from her gaze. The kind that keeps a man awake at night, he said, his voice a rough whisper. The kind that leaves scars, not all of them visible. He touched his hand to his chest, a fleeting gesture that spoke volumes. Susanna knew about scars. She had her own, hidden deep beneath the layers of her tough exterior, scars that ached with the memory of loss and grief. We all have our scars, Mr. Hollis, she said, her voice softer now, the defensiveness fading. It's what we do with them that matters. He nodded, a slow, deliberate movement of his head. That's what I'm hoping, Mrs. Monroe. That's what I'm counting on. He paused, letting his words sink in. Then he continued, his voice regaining its strength. I can handle a gun if need be. I can ride, rope, and track. I know this land, these mountains. I know the dangers that lurk out there. He gestured towards the horizon, where the distant peaks rose jagged and imposing against the sky. I'm not afraid of hard work, Mrs. Monroe. And I'm not afraid of a fight, if it comes to that. Susanna believed him. She saw it in his eyes, in the set of his jaw, in the way he carried himself. He was a man who had faced hardship, who had known violence, and who had survived. He was a man who could be dangerous, she had no doubt, but she also sensed a core of decency, a sense of honor that ran deep beneath the rough exterior. The work here is hard, Mr. Hollis, she said, testing him again. Long hours, little pay. And there's no guarantee of success. The bank is breathing down my neck, and Bartlett. She didn't finish the sentence, but the threat hung unspoken between them. Garrett met her gaze unflinchingly. I'm not looking for guarantees, Mrs. Monroe. And I'm not afraid of Bartlett. I'm looking for a chance. A chance to work, to earn my keep, and, maybe, to make amends. The word amends resonated with her. It spoke of a desire for redemption, a longing to right past wrongs. Susanna understood that desire. She felt it herself, every day, in the ache of her empty heart, in the weight of the promise she was struggling to keep. She considered his offer, weighing the risks against the potential rewards. She was desperate, that much was true, but she wasn't foolish. She wouldn't blindly trust a stranger, no matter how compelling his offer, no matter how desperate her need. I'll need references, she said, her voice firm, her eyes searching his. Names of people I can contact, people who can vouch for you. Garrett didn't hesitate. I can give you names, he said. But they might not be the kind of names you're expecting. Some of them might be men you've heard of, men with reputations. Not all of them good. He paused, letting his words sink in. But I can also give you the name of a sheriff, a man I once rode with, a man who knows me both the good and the bad. He'll tell you the truth about me, Mrs. Monroe. He won't sugarcoat it. Susanna was intrigued. This was not the response she had expected. He was being honest, upfront, offering her a glimpse into his past, a past that was clearly complicated, perhaps even dangerous. Who is the sheriff? She asked. Sheriff Elias Thorne, Garrett replied. He's in Clearwater, about a 2-day ride from here. Susanna knew the name. Elias Thorne was a legend in these parts, a lawman known for his integrity, his courage, and his unwavering commitment to justice. He was a man she respected, a man whose word she would trust. The thought of contacting Thorne, of verifying Garrett's story, gave her a measure of comfort. It was a risk, but it was a calculated risk, one she was willing to take. All right, Mr. Hollis, she said, her voice finally softening, the decision made. I'll consider your proposition, but I'll need to speak to Sheriff Thorne first. If he vouches for you, then we can talk about terms. Garrett nodded, a hint of relief in his eyes. Fair enough, Mrs. Monroe. I wouldn't expect anything less. He reached into his duster pocket and pulled out a small, worn piece of paper. He handed it to her. Thorne's contact information, he said. And a few other names just in case you want to do some more digging. Susanna took the paper, her fingers brushing his. A jolt of something unexpected, something she hadn't felt in years, ran through her. She quickly pulled her hand back, her heart beating a little faster. I'll be in touch, Mr. Hollis, she said, her voice regaining its composure. In the meantime, you can water your horse at the trough by the barn. And there's some coffee on the stove, if you're interested. She turned and walked back into the house, leaving him standing there, silhouetted against the vast expanse of her ranch, a stranger who had ridden into her life, offering her a chance, a hope, a risk. A shadow of a past he held onto so tightly, and a shadow over her own heart that she wasn't certain she wanted to dispel just yet. She felt a shiver, of apprehension and a sense of a shift in her lonely existence creeping through her. Chapter 4. Dust Devils and Unspoken Fears. Susanna watched from the kitchen window as Garrett led his horse to the water trough. He moved with an easy grace, a familiarity with animals that spoke of a life spent outdoors. The chestnut mare drank deeply, her thirst slaked after the long ride. Garrett stood beside her, his hand resting on her neck, his gaze sweeping across the ranch, taking in the dilapidated fences, the overgrown fields, the signs of neglect that were a constant reminder of Susanna's losing battle. She turned away from the window, her heart heavy with a mixture of hope and trepidation. She poured herself another cup of coffee, the strong brew a familiar comfort in the midst of her uncertainty. She glanced at the piece of paper he had given her, the name scrawled in a rough but legible hand. Sheriff Elias Thorne. The name stood out, a beacon of hope, a promise of verification. She decided to ride into town the next day, to send a telegram to Clearwater. It was a long shot, but it was the only way to be sure, the only way to know if she could trust this stranger who had offered her his help. As she sipped her coffee, her thoughts drifted back to the conversation she'd had with Garrett. His words, his demeanor, his confession of a troubled past. It all resonated with something deep within her, a sense of shared experience, of shared pain. She thought of Thomas, her husband, a good man, a gentle man, who had loved this land as much as she did. She remembered his smile, his laughter, the warmth of his hand in hers. She thought of Caleb, their son, full of life, full of dreams, cut down too soon, a victim of senseless violence. The memories brought a fresh wave of grief, a familiar ache in her heart. She had learned to live with the pain, to bury it beneath the endless chores, the bone-deep exhaustion. But it was always there, lurking beneath the surface, a constant reminder of what she had lost. She wondered about Garrett's scars, the ones he carried inside. What had he seen? What had he done? What had driven him to seek out a solitary ranch, a woman he didn't know, offering his help in exchange for
What? Peace? Redemption?
She finished her coffee, the empty mug a cold weight in her hand. She knew she was taking a risk, a big risk, but she was also desperate. She was running out of time, out of options. Garrett Hollis might be her only chance to save Whispering Pines, to keep the promise she'd made to her husband and son. The sound of a dust devil swirling outside the window caught her attention. She watched as the miniature tornado danced across the yard, kicking up dust and debris, a fleeting, chaotic force of nature. It reminded her of the turmoil she felt inside, the swirling emotions of fear, hope, and uncertainty. She had spent the last 10 years trying to control everything, trying to hold onto her ranch, her life, with a fierce grip. But she was learning, slowly, painfully, that some things were beyond her control. The weather, the market, the greed of men like Bartlett. And perhaps the arrival of a stranger like Garrett Hollis. She had a choice to make. She could cling to her fear, her distrust, and continue to fight alone, a losing battle. Or she could take a chance, a leap of faith, and accept the help that had been offered, even if it came from a man with a shadowed past. As the dust devil dissipated, leaving the air still and clear, Susanna felt a sense of calm settle over her. She had made her decision. She would contact Sheriff Thorne. She would learn the truth about Garrett Hollis. And then, she would decide whether to trust him, whether to let him into her life, onto her land. She walked to the stove and placed the empty mug on the counter. A sense of purpose, a flicker of hope, ignited within her. She would ride early, she thought, catch the stage to send the message to Clearwater. She wouldn't just wait for fate, for Bartlett or the bank to take it all, she would take action. She turned to the window, seeing him there, now sitting by the barn with his back against the wall, the horse nearby. He was an enigma, a mystery. She looked down at her hands, calloused, weathered, and strong. She wasn't afraid of hard work. She was afraid of the unknown, afraid of another loss. But another fear was beginning to creep in the thought of surviving it all, and still being alone. He looked up, met her gaze, and it felt like a silent agreement had settled between the two. She would ride in the morning, and she would be ready for whatever answers the dust and telegrams may bring. Chapter 5. A bargain struck under the desert moon. The ride to town was long and dusty, the sun beating down on Susanna's back with relentless intensity. She rode her old mare, Bess, a sturdy, reliable horse that had been her companion for years. Bess was getting on in years, just like her owner, but she still had a good spirit, a willingness to keep going, even when the going got tough. Susanna's thoughts were occupied with Garrett Hollis, the stranger who had ridden into her life, offering his help, his strength, and a hint of danger. She couldn't shake the feeling that he was both a threat and a salvation, a man who could either break her or save her. She arrived in the small, dusty town of Dust Gulch, a collection of weathered buildings huddled together against the vastness of the desert. The town was a hub for the surrounding ranches, a place to buy supplies, sell cattle, and catch up on the latest news, most of it bad. She went straight to the telegraph office, a small, cramped room at the back of the general store. The telegraph operator, a thin, bespectacled man named Silas, greeted her with a weary nod. He knew Susanna, knew her troubles, and he didn't offer any false cheer. She wrote out her message to Sheriff Elias Thorne, her hand trembling slightly as she formed the words. She kept it brief, direct, asking for information about Garrett Hollis, his character, his past, his reliability. She paid Silas, and he tapped out the message, the rhythmic clicking of the telegraph, a sound that echoed the pounding of her heart. "It'll take a day or two for a reply, Mrs. Monroe," Silas said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "Depends on how busy Thorne is." Susanna nodded, her throat tight. "I'll be back," she said. She left the telegraph office and walked across the dusty street to the saloon, the only other establishment in town that offered any semblance of comfort. She needed a drink, something to settle her nerves, something to take the edge off the anxiety that was gnawing at her. The saloon was dimly lit, smoky, and filled with the usual assortment of ranchers, cowboys, and drifters. Susanna ignored the stares, the whispers, and made her way to the bar. She ordered a whiskey, neat, and downed it in one gulp, the fiery liquid burning a path down her throat. She ordered another, and this time she sipped it slowly, letting the warmth spread through her, easing the tension in her shoulders. She thought about Garrett, about his offer, about the risk she was taking. She thought about Whispering Pines, about the land she loved, the land she was fighting to save. As she sat there, nursing her drink, she became aware of a presence beside her. She turned and saw a man standing there, a tall, burly man with a cruel smile and eyes that glittered with malice. "Bartlett." Well, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Look what the cat dragged in." Mrs. Monroe, all alone, drowning her sorrows in whiskey. Susanna met his gaze, her own eyes cold and hard. "I'm not drowning my sorrows, Bartlett," she said, her voice steady, betraying none of the fear she felt. "I'm just having a drink." "A drink to celebrate your impending doom?" He sneered. "The bank's closing in, Susanna. You're finished. Whispering Pines will be mine soon enough." "It'll never be yours," she said, her voice low and fierce. "I'll burn it to the ground before I let you have it." Bartlett laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "You're a tough old bird, I'll give you that. But you're no match for me. And you're certainly no match for the law." He gestured towards the sheriff's office across the street, where Sheriff Brody, Bartlett's puppet, could be seen sitting at his desk, his feet propped up, his hat pulled down over his eyes. "The law is on my side, Susanna," Bartlett said. "And time is running out." He leaned closer, his breath hot and foul on her face. "I'll make you a deal, Susanna. A final offer. Sell me Whispering Pines now for a fair price, and I'll let you walk away with something. Refuse, and you'll lose everything." Susanna didn't flinch. She met his gaze, her eyes burning with defiance. "I'll see you in hell first, Bartlett," she said. He laughed again, and then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Susanna watched him go, her heart pounding, her hands clenched into fists. She knew he was right. Time was running out. and she was running out of options. She finished her drink, paid the bartender, and left the saloon. She walked back to her horse, her mind racing. She had to get back to Whispering Pines, to wait for the reply from Sheriff Thorne. It was her only hope. The ride back was even harder, the sun setting, casting long, eerie shadows across the desert. The wind had picked up, whipping up dust devils that danced across the landscape like ghostly apparitions. As she neared Whispering Pines, she saw him.
Garrett.
He was standing on the porch, waiting for her, his silhouette outlined against the fading light. He had lit a lamp, the warm glow a beacon in the gathering darkness. The horse whinnied softly, and she felt a strange pull in her chest. He watched her approach, his eyes unreadable in the shadows. He didn't speak until she had dismounted and stood before him. "Did you send the telegram?" he asked, his voice low and quiet. Susanna nodded. "It'll be a day or two," she said. He nodded again, understanding. "I've been working on the fences," he said, "and I checked the south pasture. The cattle are thin, but they're holding on." She looked at him, at his strong hands, his weathered face, his gray eyes that seemed to hold both a weariness and a determination. She saw a man who had known hardship, who had faced adversity, and who had survived. She saw a man who might, just might, be her salvation. Under the vast, star-studded sky, with the desert moon casting its pale light upon them, she extended her hand. He looked at her, and then at her hand. A subtle recognition of what she was offering seemed to pass in his eyes. Hope. He took it, his grip strong and warm. "We have a deal, Mr. Hollis. Until I hear otherwise," she declared, the words solid and sure, despite the nervous flutter in her chest. Chapter 6. The weight of his gaze, the touch of his hand. The night air was cool against Susanna's skin, a welcome relief from the day's scorching heat. The desert moon hung high above them, casting long, ethereal shadows across the porch and the yard. The only sounds were the gentle chirping of crickets, the distant howl of a coyote, and the soft, rhythmic breathing of the horses in the nearby corral. Garrett's hand remained clasped around hers, his grip strong and reassuring. The touch, brief as it was, sent a shiver through her, a feeling she hadn't experienced in years, a feeling she had thought long dead. It was a feeling of connection, of shared purpose, of a fragile trust that was beginning to form between them. "Thank you, Mrs. Monroe," he said, his voice low and sincere. "I won't let you down." She looked into his eyes, the gray depths reflecting the moonlight, and saw a sincerity that she couldn't deny. She saw a man who had been hardened by life, but who still held onto a spark of decency, a desire for redemption. "I hope not, Mr. Hollis," she said, her voice a little shaky, betraying the vulnerability she usually kept hidden. "I'm putting a lot of faith in you." "I know," he said, his gaze holding hers. "And I understand the risk you're taking." He released her hand, the warmth lingering on her skin. He gestured towards the house. "I made some coffee," he said. "And there's some stew left over from supper." Susanna hadn't realized how hungry she was until that moment. The long ride, the encounter with Bartlett, the anxiety of waiting for the reply from Sheriff Thorne, it had all taken its toll. "Thank you," she said, her voice softening. "That sounds good." They went inside, the house feeling different somehow, warmer, less empty, with Garrett's presence filling the space. He had lit a fire in the hearth, the flames casting a warm glow across the room, chasing away the shadows that usually lurked in the corners. He served her a bowl of stew, thick and hearty, with chunks of beef and vegetables. It was simple fare, but it tasted like the best meal she'd had in years. They ate in silence, a comfortable silence, punctuated only by the crackling of the fire and the clinking of their spoons. As she ate, Susanna studied him, watching the way he moved, the way he held himself, the way his eyes seemed to take in everything around him. He was a man of few words, but his presence spoke volumes. He exuded a quiet strength, a sense of calm that was both reassuring and unsettling. "You said you've worked cattle before," she said, breaking the silence. "Where was that?" He looked up at her, his gray eyes thoughtful. All over, he said. Texas, Montana, Wyoming. I've driven herds across some of the roughest country you can imagine. And the other things? She asked, her voice hesitant, referring to his earlier confession. The things you're not proud of. He met her gaze directly, his expression unreadable. That's a long story, Mrs. Monroe, he said. And not one I'm eager to share. I understand, she said, respecting his privacy. But I need to know, Mr. Hollis. I need to know who I'm trusting with my ranch, with my life. He sighed, a weary sound that seemed to come from deep within him. I've ridden with outlaws, he said, his voice low and heavy. I've done things I regret. I've seen things no man should see. He paused, his gaze drifting towards the fire, his eyes filled with a sadness that made Susanna's heart ache. But I'm not that man anymore, Mrs. Monroe. I'm trying to change. I'm trying to make amends. She believed him. She saw the pain in his eyes, the remorse in his voice. She saw a man who was haunted by his past, but who was also determined to forge a new future. We all have our demons, Mr. Hollis, she said, her voice soft. It's how we face them that matters. He looked at her, a faint smile touching his lips. You're a wise woman, Mrs. Monroe, he said. Just an old woman who's seen too much, she replied, a hint of self-deprecation in her voice. They finished their meal, the silence returning, but it was different now, filled with a shared understanding, a tentative bond that was forming between them. As she cleared the dishes, Garrett stood and walked to the window, looking out at the moonlit landscape. It's a beautiful ranch, Mrs. Monroe, he said. Worth fighting for. It is, she said, her voice filled with a fierce pride. It's my home. It's all I have left. He turned and looked at her, his gaze intense, his eyes holding a promise. Then we'll fight for it together, Mrs. Monroe, he said. We'll fight for it until the end. The weight of his gaze was intense, a heavy cloak that caused her breath to hitch. She'd spent years bearing her own burdens, and to hear the promise of another shoulder beside hers, it almost took her breath away. She simply stared back, lost for words but resolute in her agreement. Chapter 7. Whispers of Outlaws and Broken Promises. The next day dawned bright and clear, the sky a vast expanse of blue, unblemished by clouds. Susanna rose early, as always, but this morning there was a new energy in her movements, a sense of purpose that had been absent for a long time. Garrett was already up, tending to the horses, his movements efficient and practiced. They shared a quick breakfast of coffee and biscuits, their conversation sparse but comfortable. The anticipation of the reply from Sheriff Thorne hung in the air, unspoken but ever-present. Susanna decided to work in the garden, a small patch of land behind the house where she grew vegetables and herbs. It was a place of solace, a place where she could connect with the earth, where she could find a measure of peace amidst the turmoil of her life. Garrett offered to help, but she declined, needing some time alone, time to think, time to sort through the emotions that were swirling inside her. As she worked, weeding and watering, her thoughts kept returning to Garrett, to his past, to his offer of help, to the strange connection she felt with him. She wondered about the outlaws he had ridden with, the things he had done, the scars he carried. She wondered if she was being foolish, trusting a man she barely knew, a man with a history of violence. But she also felt a sense of hope, a sense of possibility that she hadn't felt in years. He was strong, capable, and he seemed genuinely determined to help her. And there was something else, something she couldn't quite define, a feeling of connection, of understanding, that went beyond mere gratitude. She heard a noise and looked up to see Garrett approaching, his hat shading his eyes from the sun. He carried a rifle in his hand, his expression serious. "What is it?" she asked, her heart starting to beat faster. "Riders approaching," he said, his voice low. "3 of them. I don't recognize them." Susanna felt a prickle of fear. Outlaws. It had to be. They were the only ones who would ride onto her land uninvited, the only ones who would pose a threat. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice tight. "We wait," he said, his eyes scanning the horizon. "We see what they want." He moved to stand beside her, his body a shield, his presence reassuring. He held the rifle steady, his eyes focused, his senses alert. The riders drew closer, their horses kicking up dust as they approached. They were rough-looking men, their faces hard, their eyes cold. They wore guns slung low on their hips, their hands hovering near the handles. They reined in their horses a few yards from the garden, their gazes sweeping over Susanna and Garrett, assessing them, judging them. The leader, a tall, lean man with a scar that ran across his cheek, spoke, his voice harsh and grating. "We're looking for Garrett Hollis," he said. Susanna felt a jolt of fear. They knew his name. They were looking for him. This was worse than she had imagined. Garrett didn't flinch. He met the leader's gaze, his own eyes unwavering. "You found him," he said, his voice calm and steady. The leader smiled, a cruel, mocking smile. "We heard you were hiding out here," he said, playing ranch hand to some old woman. "I'm working here," Garrett said, his voice firm. "I'm not hiding." "You're a fool, Hollis," the leader said. "You can't run from your past. You can't escape who you are." "I'm not trying to escape," Garrett said. "I'm trying to change." The leader laughed, a harsh, derisive sound. "Change? You? That's a good one, Hollis. You're a killer, a thief, an outlaw. You'll always be one." He gestured to his companions. "We're here to take you back, Hollis. Back to where you belong." Susanna felt a surge of anger, of defiance. She wouldn't let them take him. She wouldn't let them destroy the fragile hope that had been rekindled in her. "He's not going anywhere," she said, her voice surprisingly strong, her eyes flashing with anger. "He's working for me, and I won't let you take him." The leader turned his gaze to her, his eyes filled with contempt. "You stay out of this, old woman," he said. "This is between us and Hollis." "It's between all of us," she declared. "He is under my protection now. He's a wanted man, woman," the outlaw sneered. "And you're harboring a criminal." Garrett stepped forward, placing himself between Susanna and the outlaws. "Leave her out of this," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "This is between you and me." The outlaws shifted, eyes darting between Garrett and Susanna. They knew they held a better hand, but the fire in both their eyes had given them pause. The standoff felt like it would stretch into eternity. Garrett continued, "I made her a promise. And unlike some, I intend to keep it," he said, his voice clear and unwavering. The threat hung heavy in the air. A promise made, a challenge accepted, and the lives of everyone on the ranch had shifted. Chapter 8. The Price of Loyalty, the Cost of Freedom. The leader of the outlaws, a man called Razor for the thin, cruel scar that bisected his cheek, studied Garrett for a long moment, his eyes narrowed, assessing the threat. He looked at Susanna, at her defiant stance, at the shotgun she held, its barrel pointing vaguely in their direction. He looked back at Garrett, at the rifle he held steady, at the unwavering determination in his gray eyes. "You always were a stubborn one, Hollis," Razor said, his voice a low growl. "Always had a soft spot for the weak." "She's not weak," Garrett said, his voice firm. "And she's not your concern." "She is now," Razor said. "She's interfering with our business. And we don't take kindly to interference." He gestured to his companions, two burly men who looked like they'd been born in the saddle and weaned on whiskey. They shifted their weight, their hands hovering near their guns, their eyes filled with a cold, predatory gleam. "We can do this the easy way," Hollis, Razor said. "Or we can do it the hard way. Either way, you're coming with us." Susanna felt a surge of fear, but she stood her ground, her grip tightening on the shotgun. She wouldn't back down. She wouldn't let them take Garrett, not without a fight. "He's not going anywhere," she said, her voice shaking slightly, but her eyes unwavering. "He's made a commitment to me, and I expect him to honor it." Razor turned his gaze to her, his eyes filled with contempt. "You're a fool, old woman," he said. "You're protecting a man who doesn't deserve it. A man who's betrayed us, who's stolen from us, who's left a trail of blood and broken promises behind him." "I don't know anything about that," Susanna said. "All I know is that he's offered to help me, and I've accepted his offer. He's working for me now, and he's under my protection." "Your protection?" Razor laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. You can't protect him, old woman. You can't protect yourself. He nodded to his companions, and they drew their guns, the metallic click echoing in the stillness of the morning air. Susanna raised her shotgun, her finger tightening on the trigger, but she knew she was outmatched, outgunned. Garrett stepped forward, placing himself between Susanna and the outlaws, his rifle aimed at Razor's chest. Leave her out of this, he said, his voice low and dangerous. This is between you and me. It always was, Hollis, Razor said. But you made it her problem when you decided to play ranch hand. He paused, his eyes narrowing, his gaze sweeping over Garrett, assessing him, calculating the odds. We don't want to kill you, Hollis, he said. We need you. We need your skills. We have a job, a big job, and we need you to lead it. I'm done with that life, Garrett said, his voice firm. I'm done with the killing, the stealing, the running. You'll never be done, Hollis, Razor said. It's in your blood. It's who you are. He gestured towards the vast expanse of the ranch. Look around you, Hollis, he said. This isn't you. This is a life for old women and broken-down cowboys. You're a wolf, not a sheepdog. I'm trying to change, Garrett said, his voice unwavering. I'm trying to be a better man. There's no such thing, Razor said. Once a wolf, always a wolf. He took a step closer, his hand hovering near his gun. Come with us, Hollis, he said. Come back to where you belong. We'll make you rich. We'll give you the life you deserve. Garrett didn't move. He stood his ground, his rifle aimed at Razor's chest, his eyes filled with a cold, hard determination. I'm not going anywhere, he said. I'm staying here. I'm working for Mrs. Monroe. And I'm going to protect her and her ranch from anyone who tries to harm them. Razor stared at him for a long moment, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and disappointment. You're making a mistake, Hollis, he said. A big mistake. He turned to his companions. Let's go, he said. We're wasting our time here. They holstered their guns, their movements reluctant, their eyes still fixed on Garrett. They mounted their horses, their gazes lingering on Susanna and Garrett, a silent threat hanging in the air. Razor looked at Garrett one last time, his eyes filled with a cold, hard promise. This isn't over, Hollis, he said. We'll be back. And next time, we won't be so polite. He spurred his horse, and the three outlaws rode away, disappearing into the vastness of the desert, leaving a cloud of dust and a sense of unease in their wake. Susanna lowered her shotgun, her hands trembling, her heart pounding. She looked at Garrett, at his strong, resolute face, at his gray eyes that held both a weariness and a determination. She knew the price of his loyalty, and she knew the cost of his freedom, and the choices before them were far from over. The air was heavy with the things unsaid, the dangers ahead. They'll be back, she stated quietly. He only nodded, his face like stone. Chapter 9. A storm gathers, both within and without. The departure of Razor and his men left a heavy silence in its wake, a silence filled with unspoken fears and uncertain futures. Susanna lowered the shotgun, her arms aching from the tension of holding it aloft. She looked at Garrett, his face a mask of grim determination, his eyes scanning the horizon as if expecting the outlaws to reappear at any moment. Thank you, she said, her voice a little shaky, for standing up for me, for staying. He turned to her, his gaze softening slightly. I told you I wouldn't let you down, Mrs. Monroe, he said. I meant it. They'll be back, she said, repeating her earlier statement, a statement that was more a certainty than a question. He said so himself. I know, Garrett said, and we'll be ready for them. He looked around the ranch, his eyes taking in the dilapidated fences, the overgrown fields, the signs of neglect that were a constant reminder of Susanna's struggles. He knew that they were vulnerable, that they were outmatched, that they were facing a threat that could destroy everything they were fighting for. We need to prepare, he said. We need to fortify the ranch, get supplies, and maybe find some help. Susanna nodded, her mind racing. She knew he was right. They couldn't face Razor and his men alone. They needed to be ready, to be strong, to be united. The telegram, she said, remembering the message she had sent to Sheriff Thorne. "We need to hear back from him. He might be able to help." "It's a long shot," Garrett said. "He's a busy man and he's miles away. He might not even get involved."
"He's an honest man," Susanna said.
"He'll do what's right." She looked at Garrett, at his strong, resolute face, at his gray eyes that held both a weariness and a determination. She saw a man who had faced adversity, who had known violence, and who had survived. She saw a man who was willing to fight for her ranch, for a chance at a new life. And she realized, with a start, that she was beginning to trust him, to rely on him, to feel something for him that she hadn't felt for anyone in a long, long time. As if on cue, the sky began to darken, the wind picking up, whipping up dust devils that danced across the landscape like ghostly apparitions. The air grew heavy, charged with electricity, the scent of rain filling the air. A storm was coming, a real storm, a storm that mirrored the turmoil within Susanna's heart, the turmoil within the ranch, the turmoil that was brewing on the horizon. "We should get inside," Garrett said, his voice low. "This is going to be a big one." They went inside, securing the doors and windows, preparing for the onslaught of the storm. They lit lamps, the warm glow chasing away the shadows that were gathering outside. As they worked, they talked, sharing their fears, their hopes, their plans. They talked about the ranch, about the cattle, about the bank, about Bartlett. They talked about Razor and his men, about the threat they posed, about the need to be prepared. And as they talked, Susanna felt a sense of connection with Garrett, a sense of shared purpose, a sense of a fragile trust that was growing stronger with each passing moment. The storm hit with full force, the wind howling like a banshee, the rain lashing against the windows, the thunder rumbling like a cannonade. The house shook, the roof creaked, the wind found every crack and crevice, whistling and moaning like a tormented spirit. Susanna and Garrett sat by the fire, watching the storm rage outside, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames. They were silent for a long time, listening to the fury of the storm, feeling the power of nature unleashed. "I've seen a lot of storms in my life," Susanna said, her voice soft, almost a whisper. "But this one feels different. This one feels ominous." Garrett nodded, his gaze fixed on the fire. "It's a sign," he said. "A sign of things to come." "What do you mean?" she asked. "I mean that we're in for a fight, Mrs. Monroe," he said. "A fight for our lives, a fight for this ranch, a fight for everything we believe in." He looked at her, his gray eyes filled with a fierce determination. "And we're going to win," he said. "We have to." Susanna met his gaze, her own eyes reflecting the firelight, reflecting the storm outside, reflecting the growing storm within her heart. She saw a strength in him, a resolve, that gave her courage, that gave her hope. But the fear remained. She reached for a nearby quilt and held it tight. It wasn't just the outlaws she was afraid of. It was how safe she felt with this near stranger beside her. Chapter 10. The Dance of Trust and Deception. The storm raged throughout the night, a relentless assault of wind and rain that tested the strength of the old ranch house. Susanna and Garrett stayed up late, talking, planning, preparing for whatever the next day might bring. They shared stories, guarded at first, then more open, more revealing, as the hours passed and the fire burned low. Susanna learned more about Garrett's past, about his time as an outlaw, about the things he had done, the things he regretted. She learned about the code he had lived by, a code of loyalty, of honor, of protecting the weak, a code that had been twisted and corrupted by the harsh realities of the life he had led. Garrett learned more about Susanna's life, about her marriage to Thomas, about the loss of her son, about the struggles she had faced in keeping the ranch afloat. He learned about her strength, her resilience, her unwavering determination to hold onto the land that was her legacy, her home. As they talked, a bond formed between them, a bond forged in shared hardship, in shared vulnerability, in a growing mutual respect and understanding. They were two solitary souls, scarred by life, drawn together by circumstance, by a shared need for connection, for redemption, for a second chance. By the time the first rays of dawn pierced through the storm clouds, painting the sky in hues of gray and pink, the rain had stopped, the wind had died down, and an uneasy calm had settled over the land. They went outside, surveying the damage. The storm had taken its toll. Fences were down, trees were uprooted, and the yard was a muddy mess. But the house had held, the roof had remained intact, and the livestock, though spooked, seemed to be unharmed. "We'll need to get to work," Susanna said, her voice weary but resolute. "We have a lot to do." "We'll do it together," Garrett said, his voice firm. "We'll get through this." As they began to assess the damage more thoroughly, a rider appeared on the horizon, approaching slowly, cautiously. Susanna and Garrett exchanged a look, their hands instinctively moving towards their weapons. As the rider drew closer, they recognized him. It was Silas, the telegraph operator from Dust Gulch, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. "Mrs. Monroe," he called out, his voice trembling. "I have a reply from Sheriff Thorne." Susanna's heart leaped with a mixture of hope and apprehension. This was it, the moment of truth. The answer that would determine her fate, Garrett's fate, the fate of Whispering Pines. Silas reined in his horse, his hands shaking as he pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket. He handed it to Susanna, his eyes avoiding hers. He said it was urgent," Silas stammered. "He said you needed to see it right away." Susanna unfolded the paper, her hands trembling so badly she could barely hold it. She read the message, her eyes widening in disbelief, her heart sinking like a stone. The message was brief, blunt, and devastating. Garrett Hollis. Dangerous. Wanted. Murder. Robbery. Do not trust. Proceed with caution. Thorne. Susanna felt a wave of nausea, a dizzying sense of betrayal. She looked at Garrett, his face unreadable, his gray eyes watching her, waiting for her reaction. He knew. That was clear. She crumpled the telegram in her fist, her voice a choked whisper. "You lied to me." Garrett didn't deny it. He didn't try to explain. He simply stood there, his gaze unwavering, his expression a mixture of resignation and regret. I had my reasons," he said, his voice low. "Reasons?" Susanna cried, her voice rising in anger and despair. "You're a wanted man, a murderer, and you let me trust you? You let me believe in you?" "I was going to tell you," he said. "I was waiting for the right time." "There is no right time for this, Mr. Hollis," Susanna responded, anger replacing the pain, "and there is no way I can have a man like that working these lands." "Susanna," he started. She stepped back, tears now freely flowing. "Get off my property," she stated. She could not trust him. Sheriff Thorne was clear, but the ache in her heart betrayed what she wanted. It was a dance of what she thought was right and what was before her. A deception, a trust broken. The telegram crumpled tighter in her fist. Chapter 11. Blood on the sand, tears in the rain. Garrett didn't move. He stood there, the weight of Susanna's words, the weight of Thorne's telegram, bearing down on him. He had known this moment might come, had dreaded it, had hoped against hope that he could somehow avoid it. But here it was, the truth laid bare, the past catching up to him, threatening to destroy everything he had begun to build, everything he had begun to hope for. "Susanna," he said, his voice low and earnest, "please let me explain." "Explain what?" she cried, her voice filled with pain and anger. "Explain how you lied to me, how you deceived me, how you made me believe in you, when all along you were a wanted criminal." "It's not that simple," he said. "There's more to the story than Thorne knows, than anyone knows." "I don't want to hear it," she said, turning away from him, unable to bear the sight of him, the sight of the man she had trusted, the man she had allowed herself to feel something for. "Susanna, please," he pleaded, taking a step towards her. "Just listen to me. Give me a chance to explain." She whirled around, her eyes flashing with anger. "Get off my land, Mr. Hollis," she said, her voice cold and hard, "before I call the sheriff myself." He flinched at her words, the threat stinging him like a lash. He knew he had no right to ask for her trust, no right to expect her understanding. He had lied to her, deceived her, and he had broken the fragile bond that had formed between them. But he couldn't leave, not like this, not without trying to make her understand, not without trying to salvage something from the wreckage of his past. "I know I don't deserve your trust," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "But I swear to you, Susanna, I'm not the man Thorne makes me out to be. I'm not a murderer." "The telegram says the telegram is wrong," he interrupted, his voice rising in desperation. "Or at least, it's not the whole truth. Yes, I rode with outlaws. Yes, I did things I'm not proud of. But I never killed anyone in cold blood. I never stole from anyone who didn't deserve it." He paused, his gaze searching hers, pleading for her to believe him. "The man Thorne is after, the man who committed those crimes, is Razor," he said. "The man who was here yesterday. He's the one who killed, who stole, who betrayed. I was just a kid, caught up in his web, trying to survive." Susanna stared at him, her mind reeling, her heart torn between disbelief and a desperate desire to believe him. She wanted to trust him. She wanted to believe that he was telling the truth, that he was not the monster Thorne's telegram had painted him to be. But the doubt lingered, the fear gnawed at her, the memory of his deception a fresh wound that refused to heal. "Why didn't you tell me all this before?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why did you lie?" "I was afraid," he admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "Afraid you wouldn't believe me, afraid you'd turn me away. I wanted a chance, Susanna, a chance to start over, to be a better man. And I saw that chance here, with you, on this ranch." He took a step closer, his eyes pleading with hers. "I know I messed up," he said. "I know I broke your trust. But please, Susanna, give me another chance. Let me prove to you that I'm not the man you think I am." Before Susanna could respond, a shot rang out, the sound echoing across the stillness of the morning air. Garrett staggered, his hand flying to his chest, his eyes widening in surprise and pain. Susanna screamed, her heart leaping into her throat. She saw Razor and his men emerging from behind the barn, their guns smoking, their faces twisted in cruel smiles. "I told you we'd be back, Hollis," Razor said, his voice cold and hard. "And I told you we wouldn't be polite." Garrett crumpled to the ground, blood staining the sand beneath him, his eyes still fixed on Susanna's, a look of apology, of regret, of something that looked like love, etched on his face. Susanna rushed to his side, her hands trembling as she tried to staunch the bleeding. She looked up at Razor, her eyes filled with hatred and despair. "You monsters!" she cried. "You killed him." Razor laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "He was a dead man walking, old woman," he said. "We just sped things up a bit." He gestured to his men. "Grab her," he said, "and let's get out of here." Two of the outlaws grabbed Susanna, their hands rough on her arms, their grip like iron. She struggled, fighting against them, but they were too strong. As they dragged her away, she looked back at Garrett, lying motionless on the ground, his blood staining the sand, his eyes staring up at the sky, unseeing, lifeless. Tears streamed down her face, tears of grief, of rage, of regret. She had been so close to finding something she had thought lost forever, something she had desperately needed. And now, it was gone, snatched away from her by the cruel hand of fate, by the violence of men, by the echoes of a past that refused to stay buried. The rain began to fall again, mingling with her tears, washing away the blood, but not the pain. Not the awful pain. Chapter 12. Echoes of gunfire. Whispers of regret. Susanna was dragged, kicking and screaming, towards the waiting horses. Razor mounted his steed, his eyes cold and devoid of any emotion as he looked down at her. "You should have stayed out of it, old woman," he said, his voice flat. "Now you'll pay the price." She spat at him, a futile gesture of defiance, but it was all she had left. "You'll rot in hell for this, Bartlett," she hissed, her voice choked with rage and grief. Razor's eyes widened in surprise. "Bartlett?" he said, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. "What are you talking about?" "Don't play innocent with me," Susanna cried. "I know you're working for him. He wants my land, and he sent you to kill Garrett, to get rid of me. Razor laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. You've got it all wrong, old woman, he said. I don't know any Bartlett. I'm here for Hollis, and Hollis alone. He betrayed us, stole from us, and he was going to pay. Susanna stared at him, her mind reeling. If Razor wasn't working for Bartlett, then who had shot Garrett? Who had wanted him dead? Before she could ask, another shot rang out, this one coming from the direction of the house. One of Razor's men, the one holding Susanna's arm, cried out in pain and crumpled to the ground, his grip loosening. Susanna seized the opportunity, wrenching herself free and scrambling away, running towards the house, towards the source of the gunfire, towards the only hope she had left. She saw him then, emerging from behind the corner of the house, a rifle in his hand, his face grim, his eyes blazing with fury. It was Garrett, alive, wounded but alive. He had been shot, but the bullet had apparently only grazed him, or perhaps struck something in his pocket that had deflected its full force. He had played dead, waiting for his chance, waiting for the moment to strike back. He fired again, and another of Razor's men fell, clutching his leg and screaming in agony. Razor, caught off guard, spurred his horse and fled, disappearing into the swirling dust and the gathering rain. Garrett rushed to Susanna's side, his face etched with concern. Are you all right? He asked, his voice rough with emotion. I thought you were dead, she stammered, her voice trembling, tears streaming down her face, mixing with the rain. Not yet, he said, a faint smile touching his lips. I'm a hard man to kill. He helped her to her feet, his arms supporting her, his touch sending a shiver through her, a shiver of relief, of gratitude, of something more. They looked at the two outlaws lying on the ground, one dead, the other moaning in pain. The rain was coming down harder now, washing away the blood, blurring the scene, creating a surreal, dreamlike atmosphere. We need to get inside, Garrett said, his voice urgent. We need to tend to our wounds, and we need to figure out what to do. They stumbled towards the house, supporting each other, their bodies battered, their spirits shaken, but their resolve unbroken. Inside, they collapsed onto chairs, exhausted, drained, but alive. Garrett examined his wound, a shallow gash across his ribs, bleeding but not life-threatening. Susanna tended to it, her hands trembling as she cleaned and bandaged the wound. As she worked, she couldn't help but steal glances at him, at his strong, resilient body, at his face, etched with pain but also with a determination that she admired, that she relied on. You saved my life, she said, her voice choked with emotion. And you saved mine, he replied, his gaze meeting hers. By believing in me, even when you had every reason not to. She looked away, ashamed of her earlier accusations, ashamed of her doubt, ashamed of the way she had treated him. I'm sorry, she said, her voice a whisper, for doubting you, for accusing you, for everything. He reached out and took her hand, his touch sending a warmth through her, a warmth that chased away the chill of the rain, the chill of fear, the chill of loneliness. It's all right, Susanna, he said, his voice gentle. You had every right to be suspicious. I understand. He paused, his gaze searching hers. But I need you to know the truth, he said. I need you to believe me. I'm not a murderer. I'm not the man Thorne thinks I am. He told her the whole story then, the story of his past, the story of how he had become entangled with Razor and his gang, the story of how he had tried to escape, to change, to become a better man. He told her about the robbery, about the killing, about how Razor had framed him, about how he had been running ever since, trying to clear his name, trying to find a place where he could start over. His words rang with truth now. She finally believed them all, and a sense of regret settled heavily, like a soaked wool blanket around her. The echoes of the gunshots were still ringing, the whispers of regret and choices heavy. Chapter 13. The Unveiling of Secrets, the Burden of Truth. As Garrett finished his story, the rain outside had slowed to a drizzle, the storm clouds beginning to break apart, revealing patches of blue sky. The house was quiet, The only sounds the gentle crackling of the fire in the hearth and the occasional drip of water from the leaky roof. Susanna listened intently, her heart aching for the young man he had been, caught in a web of violence and deceit, struggling to survive, struggling to find his way. She saw the pain in his eyes, the regret in his voice, the burden of the past that he carried with him. "I believe you, Garrett," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I believe you." He looked at her, his gray eyes filled with a mixture of relief and gratitude. "Thank you, Susanna," he said. "That means more to me than you know." He paused, his gaze drifting towards the window, towards the clearing sky. "But believing me isn't enough," he said. "We need proof. We need to clear my name. We need to stop Razor, once and for all."
"How?"
Susanna asked. "How can we do that? He's gone and he has men, connections." "I have an idea," Garrett said. "But it's risky. It's dangerous. And it might not work." He explained his plan, a plan that involved tracking Razor, finding evidence of his crimes, and bringing him to justice. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was the only chance they had. Susanna listened, her mind racing, her heart pounding. She knew the risks, the dangers, but she also knew that they couldn't just sit here and wait for Razor to return, or for the law, corrupted by Bartlett, to come after them. "I'm with you," she said, her voice firm, her eyes meeting his. "Whatever it takes, I'm with you." Garrett smiled, a genuine smile, a smile that reached his eyes and lit up his face. "I knew I could count on you, Susanna," he said. They spent the rest of the day preparing, gathering supplies, making plans, strengthening their resolve. They knew that they were facing a formidable enemy, an enemy who was ruthless, cunning, and desperate. But they also knew that they had something to fight for, something worth risking everything for. As evening approached, a knock on the door startled them. They exchanged a look, their hands instinctively moving towards their weapons.
Who could it be?
Had Razor returned? Or was it the law, come to arrest Garrett? Garrett cautiously opened the door, his rifle at the ready. Standing on the porch, his face etched with concern, was Sheriff Elias Thorne. Susanna's heart leaped with a mixture of surprise and relief. Thorne was here. The man she had trusted, the man who had warned her about Garrett, the man who could either save them or condemn them. "Sheriff Thorne," Garrett said, his voice calm but wary. "What brings you here?" Thorne looked at Garrett, his eyes narrowed, assessing him, judging him. "I got your telegram, Mrs. Monroe," he said. "And I came as fast as I could." He paused, his gaze shifting to Susanna. "I see my warning came too late," he said, his voice filled with regret. "No," Susanna said, stepping forward. "It wasn't too late. Garrett saved my life. He protected me from Razor and his men." Thorne looked surprised. "Razor?"
he said.
"He was here?" "He was," Garrett said.
"He came for me."
"He said I betrayed him, stole from him. But it's a lie, Sheriff. He's the one who's guilty. He's the one who committed those crimes." Thorne listened intently, his eyes searching Garrett's face, looking for any sign of deception. He had known Garrett for years, had ridden with him, had trusted him. But he had also seen the darkness in him, the potential for violence, the lure of the outlaw life. "Tell me everything," Thorne said, his voice firm. "Don't leave anything out." Garrett told him the whole story, from beginning to end, holding nothing back. He told him about his past, about his association with Razor, about the robbery, about the killing, about how he had been framed, about how he had been running ever since. He told him about Susanna, about the ranch, about his desire to change, to start over, to become a better man. Thorne listened in silence, his expression unreadable, his eyes betraying nothing of his thoughts. When Garrett finished, Thorne was quiet for a long moment, considering everything he had heard. Finally, he spoke, his voice slow and deliberate. "I believe you, Garrett," he said. "I always knew there was more to the story than what Razor claimed." Relief washed over Garrett, and beside him, he felt Susanna sag in equal parts. Thorne continued, "But it will be my word, against criminals and a corrupt lawman here. We need proof." All three fell into silence, the burden of the truth now a shared weight. The secrets were out, but the danger remained. The future was as unclear as the muddy ground after the storm. Chapter 14. A haven found, a love rekindled. The revelation of Garrett's innocence, confirmed by Sheriff Thorne's belief, brought a sense of relief, but it also underscored the danger they were in. With Razor still at large and Bartlett's influence looming over the local law enforcement, they were far from safe. "We need to find evidence," Thorne said, his voice firm. "Something concrete that we can use to expose Razor and clear Garrett's name. Something that will stand up even against Bartlett's bought and paid for sheriff." "I have an idea where we might find something," Garrett said, his mind racing. Razor had a hideout, a cabin in the mountains. He used to stash his loot there, and he might have kept records, anything that could prove his crimes. "It's a long shot," Thorne said.
"And it's dangerous."
"Razor might have men guarding the place."
"It's a risk we have to take," Garrett said.
"It's the only chance we have." Susanna, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. "I'm going with you," she said, her voice firm, her eyes meeting Garrett's. "This is my fight too." Garrett hesitated.
"Susanna, it's too dangerous," he said.
"I can't risk your life. You didn't ask for my permission before saving it earlier," she declared. "I won't stay behind." Thorne looked at Susanna, at her determined face, at the fire in her eyes. He saw a woman who had been hardened by life, a woman who had faced adversity and loss, a woman who was not afraid to fight for what she believed in. "She's right, Garrett," Thorne said. "She deserves to be a part of this. And we could use her help." Garrett knew they were right. He couldn't deny Susanna her right to fight for her home, for her future, for the man she was beginning to care for. They made plans to leave at first light, gathering supplies, preparing their horses, arming themselves for whatever they might encounter. The night was filled with a quiet tension, a sense of anticipation, a mixture of fear and hope. As they prepared, Susanna found herself drawn to Garrett, to his strength, his courage, his vulnerability. She saw the man he truly was, the man he was trying to be, a man who had been scarred by life but who still held onto a spark of decency, a desire for redemption. And she realized, with a start, that she was falling in love with him. It was a love born of adversity, of shared danger, of a growing mutual respect and understanding. It was a love that was unexpected, unconventional, but it was real. It was powerful. It was undeniable. As they sat by the fire, sharing a simple meal, their hands brushed, their eyes met, and a spark passed between them, a spark of warmth, of affection, of a love that was beginning to blossom in the midst of the danger and uncertainty. "Susanna," Garrett said, his voice low and husky. He hesitated, unsure of how to express the feelings that were swirling inside him, the feelings that he had been trying to suppress, to deny, but that he could no longer ignore. "I know," she said, her voice soft, her eyes meeting his. "I feel it too." He reached out and took her hand, his touch sending a shiver through her, a shiver of warmth, of desire, of a love that had been rekindled from the ashes of her past. They didn't speak, they didn't need to. The silence was filled with unspoken words, with unspoken emotions, with a shared understanding that went beyond words. They knew that the road ahead was dangerous, that they might not survive, that their love might be cut short before it had a chance to fully bloom. But in that moment, in the quiet intimacy of the old ranch house, with a fire casting a warm glow around them, they found a haven, a refuge, a place where they could be themselves, where they could be together, where they could love. It was a love that was fragile, vulnerable, but it was also strong, resilient, and it gave them the courage, the strength, to face whatever the future might hold. As they held each other, the storm long past, the sky outside now clear and filled with stars, they knew that they were not alone, that they had each other, and that was all that mattered. It was more than the ranch. It was about a future. Together. A shared look passed, and the path ahead was understood. Chapter 15. The Sheriff's Shadow. The Outlaw's Grasp. The journey to Razor's mountain hideout was arduous and fraught with danger. They rode through rugged terrain, across vast stretches of desert, and up steep, winding mountain trails. They kept a watchful eye out for any sign of pursuit, knowing that Razor or his men could be lurking anywhere, waiting to ambush them. Sheriff Thorne, with his years of experience tracking outlaws, led the way, his keen eyes scanning the landscape, his senses alert to any potential threat. Garrett rode beside him, his rifle at the ready, his body tense, his mind focused on the task at hand. Susanna rode behind them, her own rifle strapped to her saddle, her determination unwavering, her heart filled with a mixture of fear and a fierce resolve. As they rode, Thorne shared stories of his past, of his encounters with outlaws, of the challenges he had faced in upholding the law in this wild, untamed land. He spoke of justice, of honor, of the importance of fighting for what was right, even in the face of overwhelming odds. His words resonated with Susanna, reminding her of the values she held dear, of the principles that had guided her life, of the legacy she was fighting to protect. They also resonated with Garrett, confirming his own desire for redemption, for a chance to make amends for his past, for a chance to live a life of honor and purpose. As they neared the hideout, Thorne signaled for them to stop. They dismounted, tethering their horses in a secluded grove of trees, and proceeded on foot, moving stealthily, cautiously, through the dense undergrowth. The hideout was a small, rustic cabin, nestled in a clearing at the base of a towering cliff. It looked deserted, but Thorne knew better than to take anything at face value. Outlaws were cunning, resourceful, and they often set traps for the unwary. "Garrett, you take the back," Thorne whispered. "Susanna, you stay with me. We'll go in through the front." They moved into position, their hearts pounding, their senses alert. Thorne kicked open the door, his gun drawn, and he and Susanna rushed inside, their weapons sweeping the room. The cabin was empty, but it showed signs of recent occupation. There were empty food tins, dirty blankets, and the lingering smell of stale tobacco smoke. A quick search revealed a hidden compartment beneath a loose floorboard. Inside, they found a strongbox, locked and heavy. "This is it," Garrett said, his voice filled with excitement. "This is where Razor kept his loot and maybe his records." They tried to force the lock, but it was too strong. They needed a key or a tool to pick the lock. "I used to be good at this," Garrett said, a hint of his old self, a flicker of a smile on his lips. He searched the cabin and found a thin, sturdy piece of metal, a broken knife blade. He carefully inserted it into the lock, his hands moving with a practiced dexterity, his eyes focused on the intricate mechanism. Susanna and Thorne watched with bated breath, their hopes rising with each click, each subtle movement of the tumblers. Finally, with a satisfying snap, the lock sprang open. They lifted the lid of the strongbox, their hearts pounding with anticipation. Inside, they found a stack of money, a few pieces of jewelry, and a small, leather-bound book. Garrett grabbed the book, his hands trembling as he flipped through the pages. It was a ledger, filled with names, dates, and amounts, a detailed record of Razor's illegal activities, including the robbery that Garrett had been accused of. "This is it," Garrett said, his voice filled with triumph. "This is the proof we need. This will clear my name." As they examined the ledger, they heard a noise outside, the sound of approaching horses. They exchanged a look, their faces grim. Razor had returned. They quickly gathered the evidence, stuffing the ledger and the money into their saddlebags. They knew they had to get out of there, to get back to town, to present the evidence to the authorities, to expose Razor and clear Garrett's name. But as they stepped outside, they found themselves surrounded by Razor and his men, their guns drawn, their faces twisted in cruel smiles. "Well, well, well," Razor said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Look what we have here. The sheriff, the outlaw, and the old woman. All together, ready to be taken down. They were trapped, outnumbered, outgunned. It seemed like their journey, their fight, their hope, was about to end, right there, in the shadow of the outlaw's grasp. But neither would yield. This stand was not just about clearing a name. It was about something much more important. Chapter 16. Between a rock and a hard place, a heart divided. Razor's men had them surrounded, their guns trained on Garrett, Susanna, and Sheriff Thorne. The air was thick with tension, the silence broken only by the snorting of horses and the ragged breathing of the men. "I'll give you credit, Hollis," Razor sneered. "You almost got away with it. Almost managed to turn the tables on me. But you should have known better than to cross me." "No one crosses Razor and lives to tell about it. It's over, Razor," Thorn said, his voice calm and steady, despite the dire situation. "We have proof of your crimes. We have the ledger. You're finished." Razor laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "You think that little book scares me?" he said. "You think anyone will believe you? I have friends in high places, Sheriff. Friends who can make that ledger disappear, just like I'm going to make you disappear." He gestured to his men. "Take them," he said, "and make it look like an accident." As Razor's men moved to disarm them, Susanna saw her chance. She had been holding her rifle loosely, seemingly subdued, but now she raised it, aiming at Razor, her finger tightening on the trigger. "Don't even think about it, old woman," Razor said, his eyes narrowing, his own gun still trained on Garrett. "You shoot me, and Hollis dies.
You all die."
Susanna hesitated, her heart pounding, her mind racing. She could shoot Razor, but she knew that Garrett would be killed instantly. She couldn't risk it. She couldn't sacrifice him. Not for anything. "Drop the rifle, Susanna," Garrett said, his voice low and firm. "It's not worth it." She looked at him, at his gray eyes, filled with a mixture of fear and a strange, calm acceptance. He was willing to sacrifice himself for her, for Thorn, for the chance to bring Razor to justice. But she couldn't let him. She couldn't bear the thought of losing him. Not now, not after everything they had been through. Not after she had finally found something to live for, something to fight for. "I can't," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Do it, Susanna," Garrett said, his voice stronger now. "It's the only way." She hesitated, her finger trembling on the trigger, her heart torn between her love for Garrett and her desire for justice. She looked at Razor, at his cruel, mocking smile, at his eyes, filled with a cold, hard determination. And then she made her decision. She lowered her rifle, slowly, reluctantly, letting it fall to the ground with a dull thud. "That's a good girl," Razor said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Now you're all going to come with us. We're going to have a little talk. And then we're going to decide what to do with you." As Razor's men disarmed them and forced them to mount their horses, Susanna felt a wave of despair wash over her. She had failed. She had let Garrett down. She had let Thorn down. She had let herself down. But as she looked at Garrett, she saw something in his eyes, something that surprised her, something that gave her a flicker of hope. It was a look of gratitude, of respect, of love. He knew why she had done it. He understood her decision. And he didn't blame her. He loved her for it. As they rode away, captives of Razor and his men, Susanna's heart was heavy with despair, but it was also filled with a fierce determination. She wouldn't give up. She wouldn't lose hope. She would find a way to escape, to fight back, to save Garrett, to save herself, to save everything she held dear. She didn't know how, she didn't know when, but she knew that she would not surrender. She was Susanna Monroe, and she was not a woman who gave up easily. The ride was long and silent, the tension palpable. Susanna's mind raced, searching for a way out, a plan, a glimmer of hope in the darkness that had enveloped them. She looked at Garrett, and a silent conversation took place. Between a rock and a hard place, there was a space, and that space was filled with a love and unspoken promise. Chapter 17. The Ghosts of Yesterday, the Hope of Tomorrow. The ride back to Dust Gulch was a silent, agonizing journey. Susanna, Garrett, and Sheriff Thorn were bound and guarded, their captors, Razor and his men, riding alongside them, their faces grim, their eyes cold. The setting sun cast long, eerie shadows across the landscape, mirroring the darkness that had settled over their hopes. Susanna's mind raced, replaying every decision, every choice that had led them to this point. She blamed herself for lowering her rifle, for not taking the shot that could have ended it all, even at the cost of Garrett's life. But she knew, deep down, that she couldn't have done it. She couldn't have sacrificed him. Not for anything. As they neared the town, Susanna saw the familiar buildings, the dusty streets, the saloon, the general store, the sheriff's office. But it was a different town now, a town under the control of Razor and his men, a town where justice was a mockery, where the law was a tool of oppression. They were taken to the jail, a small, dilapidated building next to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Brody, Bartlett's puppet, was waiting for them, his face a mask of smug satisfaction. Well, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Look what the cat dragged in. The notorious outlaw, Garrett Hollis, the meddling old woman, Susanna Monroe, and the disgraced sheriff Elias Thorne. All together, ready to face justice. You call this justice? Thorne said, his voice filled with contempt. You're nothing but a puppet, Brody, a tool of Bartlett and Razor. Brody laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. I'm the law in this town, he said, and I decide what's justice and what's not. He gestured to his deputies, two burly men who looked more like thugs than lawmen. Lock them up, he said, and make sure they don't escape. They were thrown into separate cells, small, cramped, and filthy. Susanna found herself alone, the darkness closing in on her, the despair threatening to overwhelm her. She sat on the cold, hard floor, her head in her hands, her tears flowing freely. She had lost everything. Her ranch, her freedom, her hope, and the man she loved. She had failed. She had let everyone down. But as she sat there, in the darkness and the silence, a spark of defiance flickered within her. She wouldn't give up. She wouldn't surrender. She was Susanna Monroe, and she was not a woman who broke easily. She thought of Thomas, of Caleb, of the life they had built together, of the legacy they had left her. She thought of Garrett, of his courage, his strength, his vulnerability, of the love that had blossomed between them, a love that was now threatened, a love that she would fight for, no matter the cost. She stood up, her legs shaky, her body aching, but her spirit renewed. She walked to the bars of her cell, her eyes scanning the room, looking for a way out, a weakness, a chance. She saw a loose stone in the wall, a small crack in the mortar. She began to work on it, using her fingers, her nails, anything she could find, to pry it loose, to widen the crack, to create an opening. It was slow, painstaking work, her fingers bleeding, her nails breaking, but she didn't stop. She worked tirelessly, fueled by her anger, by her grief, by her love for Garrett, by her determination to survive, to fight back, to win. As she worked, she heard voices, whispers coming from the other cells. It was Garrett and Thorne, talking, planning, plotting. We need to get out of here, Garrett said, his voice low and urgent. We need to find a way to escape, to expose Razor and Bartlett, to clear my name. I'm working on it, Thorne said. There's a weak spot in the floorboards. I'm trying to pry them loose. Susanna listened, her heart filled with a renewed hope. They were not alone. They were still fighting. They were still a team. She would work through the night. She would find a way. For her, for Garrett, for the life and new love they deserved. The ghosts of yesterday were a driving force. But the hope of tomorrow was stronger, fueled by grit and determination. Chapter 18. A Ride Through the Valley of Death. Hours passed, and the jail remained shrouded in a tense silence, punctuated only by the occasional creak of the old building and the muffled whispers of the prisoners. Susanna continued to work on the loose stone, her fingers raw and bleeding, her body aching with fatigue, but her spirit unwavering. Finally, with a surge of effort, she managed to pry the stone loose, creating a small opening, just large enough for her to squeeze through. She peered through the hole, her eyes adjusting to the darkness. She saw that she was in a small, unused storage room, filled with dusty crates and cobwebs. She carefully squeezed through the opening, her body scraping against the rough stone, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and excitement. She was out of her cell, but she was still trapped in the jail, surrounded by enemies. She crept through the storage room, her senses alert, listening for any sign of movement, any indication that she had been discovered. She found a back door, locked and bolted, but the wood was old and rotten, weakened by years of neglect. She searched the room for something she could use to force the door, a tool, a weapon, anything that could help her escape. She found a rusty crowbar, leaning against a wall, hidden beneath a pile of old sacks. She grabbed the crowbar, its weight comforting in her hands. She approached the door, her heart pounding, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. She inserted the crowbar into the crack between the door and the frame, and she began to pry, putting all her weight, all her strength, all her desperation into the effort. The wood creaked, groaned, and splintered, but it held. She kept prying, her muscles screaming in protest, her hands slick with sweat, but she didn't give up. She couldn't give up. Finally, with a loud crack, the door gave way, splintering and breaking, opening just enough for her to squeeze through. She slipped outside, into the cool night air, her lungs filling with the sweet scent of freedom. She found herself in a narrow alleyway behind the jail, hidden from the street, shrouded in darkness. She knew she had to find Garrett and Thorn to help them escape, to get out of town, to find a way to expose Razor and Bartlett, to clear Garrett's name. She crept along the alleyway, her eyes scanning the shadows, her ears straining for any sound. She heard voices coming from the front of the jail, the voices of Brody and his deputies, laughing, joking, celebrating their victory. She knew she had to be careful, to be stealthy, to avoid detection. She had to find a way to get to Garrett and Thorn, to free them, to escape together. She saw a window, a small barred window at the back of the jail, the window of Garrett's cell. She approached it cautiously, peering inside. She saw Garrett, sitting on the floor, his back against the wall, his eyes closed, his face pale and drawn. He looked defeated, broken, his spirit crushed by the weight of his captivity. Susanna tapped on the window, lightly at first, then louder, until he stirred, his eyes opening, his gaze focusing on her. He saw her, his eyes widening in surprise, in disbelief, in hope. He rushed to the window, his hands gripping the bars, his face pressed against the cold metal. "Susanna," he whispered, his voice filled with emotion.
How?
"How did you get out?" "I found a way," she whispered back. "I'm going to get you out of here."
Both of you.
She showed him the crowbar, her eyes explaining her plan. He nodded, understanding, his own eyes filled with a renewed hope, a renewed determination. She began to work on the bars, inserting the crowbar between them, prying, twisting, using all her strength, all her skill, to bend them, to break them, to create an opening. It was a difficult, dangerous task, the metal resisting her efforts, the noise threatening to alert the guards, but she didn't give up. She kept working, fueled by her love for Garrett, by her determination to save him, to save Thorn, to save themselves. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the bars gave way, bending and breaking, creating an opening just large enough for a man to squeeze through. Garrett slipped through the opening, his body brushing against hers, his touch sending a shiver through her, a shiver of relief, of gratitude, of love. She looked at Garrett. She knew what came next. They had to move. And quickly. The Valley of Death was calling, and they needed to get out of town.
Now.
Chapter 19. The Reckoning, the Redemption. With Garrett free, they quickly moved to Thorn's cell, repeating the process, using the crowbar to bend the bars, creating an opening for the sheriff to escape. The three of them, reunited and free, crept through the alleyway, their hearts pounding, their senses alert, their every move calculated to avoid detection. "We need to get to our horses," Thorn whispered. "They're at the livery stable at the edge of town." "And then?" Susanna asked.
"We ride," Garrett said.
"We ride like the wind. We put as much distance between us and this town as we can." "But what about the ledger?" Susanna asked. "What about exposing Razor and Bartlett? What about clearing your name?"
"We can't do it here," Garrett said. "Not now.
We're outnumbered, outgunned. We need to regroup, to find help, to find a way to bring them to justice." Thorn nodded in agreement.
He's right, Susanna, he said.
We need to get to a safe place to plan our next move. We need to find someone we can trust, someone who can help us. They reached the edge of town, the livery stable looming before them, a dark, silent building filled with the scent of horses and hay. They crept inside, their footsteps muffled by the soft dirt floor, their eyes scanning the shadows, searching for their mounts. They found their horses, saddled and ready, as if waiting for them. But as they approached, they realized they were not alone. Standing in the shadows, his gun drawn, his face twisted in a cruel smile, was Bartlett. Well, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Look who we have here. The escapees. I thought you might try something like this. He gestured with his gun.
I've been waiting for you, he said.
I knew you wouldn't just give up. You're too stubborn, too determined, too much like your old man, Susanna. Susanna felt a surge of anger, of hatred, for this man who had been tormenting her for years, who had tried to steal her ranch, who had conspired with Razor, who had threatened her life and the life of the man she loved. It was you, she said, her voice low and fierce. You were behind it all. You sent Razor to kill Garrett, to get rid of me, to take my land. Bartlett laughed, a harsh, mocking sound.
Of course it was me, he said.
Who else? I've wanted Whispering Pines for years. And now I'm finally going to get it. He raised his gun, aiming it at Susanna. You're a fool, Susanna, he said. You should have sold when you had the chance. Now you're going to lose everything. Before he could pull the trigger, Garrett lunged forward, tackling Bartlett, knocking him to the ground, the gun flying from his hand. The two men grappled, wrestling on the floor of the stable, their bodies intertwined, their fists flying. Thorne drew his own gun, aiming it at the entrance of the stable, ready to defend them against any of Razor's men who might appear. Susanna grabbed Bartlett's discarded gun, her hands trembling, her heart pounding, her eyes fixed on the struggle before her. Garrett and Bartlett were evenly matched, both strong, both determined, both fighting for their lives. But Garrett had the advantage of youth, of agility, and of a righteous fury that fueled his strength. He landed a blow to Bartlett's jaw, a hard, crushing blow that sent the older man reeling. He followed it up with another and another until Bartlett was dazed, disoriented, his defenses crumbling. Garrett pinned Bartlett to the ground, his fist raised, ready to deliver the final blow. But he hesitated, his eyes searching Bartlett's face, seeing the fear, the desperation, the realization of defeat. He couldn't do it. He couldn't kill him in cold blood. He was not a murderer. He was not like Razor. He was not like Bartlett. He lowered his fist, his body trembling with the effort to restrain his anger, his desire for revenge. It's over, Bartlett, he said, his voice low and firm. You're finished. Thorne stepped forward, his gun still drawn, and he handcuffed Bartlett, securing him, ending the threat. Susanna rushed to Garrett's side, her arms embracing him, her body trembling with relief, with gratitude, with love. You did it, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. You saved us. You saved everything. He held her close, his arms tight around her, his face buried in her hair, his body shaking with the aftermath of the fight, with the release of tension, with the overwhelming emotion of the moment. They had won. They had survived. They had defeated their enemies. They had cleared Garrett's name, at least for now. They had a future. The reckoning had come, and redemption was on the horizon. They could finally breathe. Together. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and horizons. With Bartlett secured and the immediate threat neutralized, they knew they couldn't stay in Dust Gulch. They retrieved the ledger from Garrett's saddlebag, their proof of Razor's and Bartlett's crimes, and prepared to leave, to seek justice and a safe haven. We need to get to Clearwater, Thorne said. To my office. It's the only place where we can be sure of a fair hearing, where we can present the evidence and expose Bartlett's corruption. They mounted their horses, the first rays of dawn painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, a stark contrast to the darkness they had just escaped. They rode out of Dust Gulch, leaving behind the town that had been a symbol of their struggles, their fears, their near defeat. The ride to Clearwater was long and arduous, but they were fueled by a renewed hope, a sense of purpose, a determination to see justice done. They rode in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, reflecting on the events of the past few days, on the dangers they had faced, on the bonds they had forged. As they rode, Susanna couldn't help but steal glances at Garrett, at his strong profile, at his steady gaze, at the quiet confidence that had returned to his eyes. She saw the man she loved, the man who had saved her life, the man who had proven his worth, the man who had earned her trust, her respect, her heart. And she knew that she was ready to embrace the future, whatever it might hold, as long as she had him by her side. They reached Clearwater, a bustling town, a stark contrast to the desolate quiet of Dust Gulch. They rode straight to the sheriff's office, a sturdy, imposing building, a symbol of law and order, a beacon of hope in a land plagued by corruption and violence. Thorne presented the ledger, the evidence of Razor's and Bartlett's crimes, to the local sheriff, a stern but fair man, who listened intently, his eyes widening in disbelief as he examined the meticulous records of their illegal activities. "This is damning evidence, Thorne," he said. "This will put them away for good." He immediately issued warrants for the arrest of Razor and his men, and he sent a telegram to Dust Gulch, ordering the release of any prisoners held unjustly by Brody and the seizure of Bartlett's assets, including his ill-gotten gains from his corrupt dealings. With the wheels of justice set in motion, Susanna, Garrett, and Thorne felt a sense of relief, a sense of accomplishment, a sense of closure. They had done it. They had fought back. They had won. They had secured their future. But there was one final confrontation, a confrontation of hearts, that needed to take place. As they stood outside the sheriff's office, the sun shining brightly, the town bustling around them, Susanna turned to Garrett, her eyes searching his, her heart filled with a love that had blossomed in the midst of adversity, a love that had been tested, a love that had endured. "What now, Garrett?" she asked, her voice soft, her gaze unwavering. "What happens now?" He looked at her, his gray eyes filled with a tenderness, a warmth, a love that mirrored her own. He reached out and took her hand, his touch sending a shiver through her, a shiver of anticipation, of hope, of a future they could finally embrace. "Now," he said, his voice low and husky, "we go home. To Whispering Pines. Together." She smiled, a radiant smile that lit up her face, a smile that reflected the joy in her heart, the love in her soul, the promise of a new beginning. "Together," she repeated, her voice filled with a certainty, a conviction, a love that would last a lifetime. They mounted their horses, and hand in hand, they rode out of Clearwater, leaving behind the law, the justice, the victory, and heading towards the horizon, towards Whispering Pines, towards their home, towards their future, together. The final confrontation had taken place. Hearts and horizons aligned. A new chapter was beginning. It was time for the ranch to have its peace again, under a shared sky, tended by shared hands. The final ride home had started. Epilogue. The years that followed were a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the power of love, and the enduring strength of hope. Whispering Pines, once on the brink of ruin, flourished under the combined care of Susanna and Garrett. The ranch, once silent and lonely, echoed with laughter, with the sounds of life, with the steady rhythm of hard work and shared dreams. Garrett, his name cleared, his past behind him, embraced his new life with a quiet determination, a fierce loyalty, and a deep love for Susanna. He proved to be not only a capable ranch hand, but a loving partner, a steadfast companion, a man who cherished every moment, every sunrise, every shared smile. Susanna, her heart healed, her spirit renewed, found a joy she had thought lost forever. She rediscovered the beauty of the land, the satisfaction of hard work, the comfort of companionship, and the enduring power of love. She blossomed, her strength and resilience complemented by a newfound tenderness, a gentle warmth that radiated from her like the desert sun. Sheriff Thorne became a frequent visitor, a trusted friend, a reminder of the battles they had fought, the victories they had won, the justice they had secured. He watched with pride as Whispering Pines thrived, as Susanna and Garrett built a life together, a life filled with love, with purpose, with a shared commitment to the land and to each other. Bartlett, stripped of his wealth and power, languished in prison, his dreams of owning Whispering Pines shattered, his life a testament to the futility of greed and the enduring power of justice. Razor and his remaining men were eventually captured, their reign of terror brought to an end, their names fading into the annals of frontier history, a cautionary tale of violence and betrayal. The seasons changed, the years rolled by, and Whispering Pines became a haven, a sanctuary, a place where love bloomed, where life flourished, where the echoes of the past mingled with the promise of the future. One evening, as the sun set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Susanna and Garrett stood on the porch of the ranch house, their arms around each other, their gaze fixed on the vast expanse of their land, their home. "We did it, Susanna," Garrett said, his voice filled with a quiet pride, a deep satisfaction. "We saved Whispering Pines." "We did it together," she replied, her voice soft, her eyes shining with love. "We built a life together." They stood in silence, watching the stars emerge, one by one, filling the vast canvas of the night sky, a silent testament to the enduring power of love, of hope, of a second chance. The air was filled with the scent of pine, the gentle breeze whispering through the trees.